Good morning! Welcome to Business 360, where business, markets, and the economy come into full view. I'm Margaux Salcedo, and this is the Bilyonaryo News Channel. At least 20 companies allegedly linked to Vice President Sara Duterte and her husband are now covered by subpoenas issued by the Senate Impeachment Court. A jumbo fuel price hike hits the pumps today, adding to pressure on consumers paying the highest electricity bills in Southeast Asia. And we sit down with National Treasurer Sharon Almanza on the government's record borrowing plan, global bonds, and the challenge of keeping the budget deficit in check. The Senate Impeachment Court has widened its probe into the allegations against Vice President Sara Duterte, ordering the release of financial records tied to her, her husband, and several companies. Hannah T. has our lead story on Business 360.
At least 20 companies allegedly linked to Vice President Sara Duterte and her husband are now covered by subpoenas issued by the Senate Impeachment Court, most of which are food corporations as well as Davao-based companies. The order forms part of the court's latest ruling on the House prosecution's request for financial records in impeachment trial. The court allowed the subpoena of Peso Bank records of the vice president, her husband, Attorney Mans Carpio, their joint accounts, Carpio lawyers, and 19 corporate entities found to have a prima facie link to the respondent. But the court denied the requests involving JTC Group of Companies and Pikimong Philippines Corporation, ruling that the House prosecution failed to establish a sufficient preliminary link between those companies and the couple. The prosecution earlier asked the impeachment court to subpoena the said documents needed to provide the unexplained wealth allegations versus the VP as part of its impeachment complaint against her. The impeachment court also granted the prosecution's request to subpoena relevant records from the Anti-Money Laundering Council. But those documents will first be reviewed in camera or privately by the presiding officer before any decision is made on whether they may be disclosed to either party. The prosecution earlier said AMLAC records show VP Sara's financial activity already surged to about 208 million pesos in 2007. Then exceeded 400 million pesos annually between 2009 and 2013, with peaks of about 705 million pesos in 2009, 649 million pesos in 2010, and 597 million in 2011. From 2007 to 2013, while she was serving as vice mayor and then mayor of Davao City, her total financial activity reached more than 3 billion pesos, which the prosecution argues is relevant to its allegation of unexplained wealth and her fitness to hold public office. The court also allowed the subpoena of the VP's BIR records from 2007 to 2021. Presiding Officer Cheese Escudero stressed that these records will be used only to establish a financial baseline and not to prove new impeachable offenses outside the articles of impeachment. The BIR, banks, and AMLAC have been directed to respond to the subpoenas on July 30. Hannah Tia, Bilyonaryo News Channel.
The government has disbursed nearly all of the 2026 budget allocated to the Department of Public Works and Highways, months after the flood control scandal slowed the release of funds. As of end June, the agency had received 99.5% of its adjusted allocation, or about 527.7 billion pesos. Overall, the Department of Budget and Management had released nearly 90% of the 6.79 trillion peso national budget as of end June. The DBM says this is slightly behind last year's pace. Agriculture posted the slowest release rate at 63.7%, while education, the largest spending agency, stood at 85.5%. Labor and energy received their full budgets. The Philippines' gross international reserves climbed in June, lifted by a global bond sale and earnings from overseas investments. The figures stood at $104.7 billion at the end of June, up from 104 billion a month earlier. That's enough to cover 6.8 months of imports and other foreign payment obligations. The national government raised $2.5 billion from its global bond sale last month. Meanwhile, the BSP reported a $3.4 billion balance of payment surplus in June, trimming the country's deficit for the first half of the year to $3.9 billion. And now we are so honored to have with us today. The government is borrowing at record levels even as it works to narrow the deficit and keep the country's finances steady. For more on this, we now welcome National Treasurer Sharon Almanza. Good morning, Ma'am Shara. We're so honored to have you on Business 360.
Good morning, Margaux. And how are you?
Yes, how are you? So now, life after government. So good to see that you're still working on this. I see that this past month, was it June, that you had the DBCC meeting?
Right.
But before that, I want to tell everybody how I met you first. I first met you at the World Bank. I remember that I was there to host the Philippine Economic Briefing with the Department of Budget and Management, and the President was also there in Washington, D.C.
Correct.
And you were at the time with World Bank, and you welcomed us there.
It was in 2023, I think.
That was around 2023.
Yes.
So at the time, our national treasurer
Or
was
2022, was it?
I think
don't remember.
2023.
23.
Yeah, although the first one, New York po, was 2022.
Correct.
And then the national treasurer at the time was Toplea, and now, who's now with the Monetary Board. What enticed you to come back to the Philippines to become our national treasurer?
Well, I've always been a public servant. So the secondment at the World Bank, it's not a permanent position. So, at the Department of Finance and also at the Bureau of the Treasury, we have that opportunity to be seconded at the World Bank. And it was a 2-year stint. And
I understand at the time you were deputy treasurer.
Treasurer, yes.
So you have always been with the Bureau of the Treasury.
Bureau of the Treasury, and before that, Department of Finance.
And the Department of Finance. So speaking of the Department of Finance, there was a Development Budget Coordination Committee, which, for those of you who are not aware of the DBCC, it's comprised of the Department of Finance, the Department of Budget and Management, the DepDev, so our economic managers, plus the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas,
Correct.
and of course the National Treasurer is always there. So it comes up with our forecasts, our targets, and now the target has been adjusted again. I remember back in 2022, 2023, when I met you, the target at the time for GDP growth was 6 to 8%.
Correct.
But now for 2026, it's been adjusted to 3.5 to 4.5%. So we're trying to do this amidst all the global headwinds. The Department of Finance has said that they're going to be more efficient in their collections, and the Department of Budget and Management has a fiscal spending plan, of course. But how about for the Treasury? How are we going to keep our deficit in check? And what are your plans?
Yeah. Well, let me just provide a context of the Treasury and our primary mandate. So the primary mandate of the Bureau of the Treasury is to manage the financial resources of the government, as well as ensure that we have sufficient funds to finance the operations of the national government. It is basically the day-to-day operation, making sure that when government agencies spend, we have the resources. So day-to-day, we make sure that we have the liquidity. And by doing that, the Treasury supports the government primarily two things. One is, as mentioned, financing the government, and this is through borrowing. So basically, debt management. Second one is revenue generation. We also provide revenue. So we have operations. In that regard, we support the budget as well through our revenue mobilization efforts, such as income from our investment, making sure that when the government is not yet spending, government agencies, we maximize the return on idle funds. Now, on the borrowing side, we make sure that we manage prudently and effectively the borrowing of the government. We have a debt management strategy target that we actually adhere to, and that medium-term debt management strategy, we call it MTDS. That MTDS defines or guides our borrowing plan year over year. And we make sure that we don't borrow more than what we plan, because there's a cost to borrowing, right? And it will increase the interest payment, and interest payment puts pressure on the budget. So long as we're able to manage that interest payment, we are supporting that budget deficit because we don't add pressure to the deficit. Now, on the debt management side, we make sure again that we continue to manage the debt portfolio of the government, managing all the risk. I'm not sure how familiar you are in this aspect, but we look at different metrics, not only the cost of borrowing, but also the risk. Say, for instance, foreign exchange risk, right? We have a certain portfolio of our debt in foreign currency denominated portfolio, but we are trying to minimize that. So about 35% of our portfolio is in foreign currency. And we want to actually even lower that ratio so that we are able to manage that volatility. So in managing interest rate risk as well, we keep our portfolio, most of our portfolio is in fixed rate debt, meaning to say that we have certainty in paying our debt. And then another risk that we are managing is refinancing. So refinancing meaning, we will not default on the debt of the Republic. So we make sure that, we are really able to manage that risk.
It's a tough job. It's a big ask to the tune of 18 trillion pesos.
That's the debt stock now.
That's
right?
the debt stock now. But you mentioned that 30% is foreign. Is there
35%.
35% is foreign. In your strategy, I understand that a big chunk of it actually goes back to the Philippines because it's local. You borrow from local
market. Yes.
market. Yeah. Could you explain that so that we understand more clearly how this actually goes back to the Philippine economy and how ultimately it also spurs growth? Correct.
So you mentioned deficit, right? The country continues to have a deficit, so that's 5.4% this year. But we have a fiscal consolidation path, which we aim to gradually reduce that deficit. We borrow because we want to continue to support the economy, right? You have that fiscal gap because your revenue is not sufficient to cover your requirements, right? But debt is not inherently bad, just like any household, right? That you want to have a house, say for instance, but your revenue is not sufficient, so you borrow from a bank. So that's what government does. We borrow so that we can spur economic growth. Now, that deficit, we will be sourcing that mostly from the domestic market so that we keep that foreign currency debt at a minimal level, as mentioned, 35%. So 70 or 75% of our borrowing will be sourced domestically. So as you mentioned, we will be borrowing from ourselves because, we want to manage the risk, and we will essentially the economy is supporting its economy because we want to be self-reliant even for our borrowing.
Yeah, so it's going back to our local
Yes.
banks. But you also mentioned that there is still a fiscal gap. So that is what we're trying to do. And that is why I understand there's a borrowing for this year of 2.68 trillion.
More or less, yes.
And I think it would also be quite difficult because, as you know, the Iran war is ongoing. We thought that last June, with the ceasefire and the memorandum of understanding between the United States and Iran, things would ease up. But the President of the United States has said we're back to war. Has that affected your strategy for borrowing for the rest of the year?
Well, to some extent, it has. We had some small adjustment in our borrowing plan for the year. So initially, we set the target at 75-25. 75 meaning we will source 75% from the local market and 25% from external source. But given the current scenario, and also we've been monitoring the liquidity, how the rates have changed. We've slightly shifted our financing. So from 75-25, it will now be around 70-30. So we reduce pressure in the local market. That's why we made that revision. So some of our borrowing will be coming from official development assistance. So there is a slight increase or a slight shift. Maximizing.
I also noticed that you've been quite aggressive with your global bonds. In fact, we read it as part of the news earlier. Could you tell us about that? And I heard that you also now have retail bonds. And how can the public participate in that? Would we be able to invest given these higher interest rates?
Oh, thank you. Thank you for reminding me of the RTB. Well, first, on the global bonds. It's part of our plan for the year. So for the year, usually we have a mix, as mentioned, so 75 or 70-30. And then out of the 30, there's a split between tapping the official development assistance. So these are the donors such as World Bank, ADB, ADB, and other bilateral creditors such as JICA, AFD. Now, on the global front, this is the issuance that we do to tap the international market. That's the one that you were mentioning about, the global bonds.
And how about the RTP?
RTB, this
RTB.
is part of our issuance onshore, retail treasury bonds. This year...
Can we participate for this?
Of course, of course. This year actually is the 25th year of the RTB, or the retail treasury bonds. So it's been, the Treasury has been issuing this for 25 years already, since 2001. And we've raised 6.19 trillion pesos already in aggregate since 2001. So annually, the Treasury usually issues an RTB. And this year, as mentioned, it's our 25th year. So we are planning, of course, to have one this year. And the investing public can participate. So RTB really was issued because, we want to also encourage the investing public, not only the banks, not only the institutional investors, but, such as ourselves. You can invest in retail treasury bonds.
So anyone?
Anyone. We've even partnered last year with GCash and PDAX. I'm not sure how familiar you are, but it's now available in the app, GCash. So if you have that platform, you can actually invest. You can participate in nation building through purchase of RTB and treasury bills in the app.
So you seem truly to be on the right track. We just have one last question. Before we take a break, what keeps you up at night, pa? Malaki-laki ng utang natin, but you have been doing such a great job managing our debt.
Well, raising funds for the government is not an easy task. And because we take our job seriously, we don't want to put more pressure on the rates. So basically, how to raise, the rest of the 2 trillion pesos for the rest of the year without necessarily borrowing too much or, putting more pressure because of interest rates. So basically, interest rates keep me awake at night.
But you have been doing such a great job, ma'am. Thank you, and more power to you.
Thank you.
So now we are taking a break. Business 360 will be right back. Welcome back to Business 360. I am Margaux Salcedo. The jumbo fuel price hike takes effect today, adding to the pressures on consumers already paying the highest electricity rates in Southeast Asia. Che Sulit reports.
Another round of big-time fuel price increases takes effect today. Based on the Energy Department's fuel price adjustments, diesel surged by nearly 11 pesos per liter. Kerosene climbed even higher, up by almost 12 pesos per liter. Gasoline, meanwhile, rose by more than 3 pesos per liter. Energy Secretary Sharon Almanza said escalating tensions in the Middle East have once again pushed global crude oil prices higher. To soften the blow, some oil companies are rolling out the increases on a staggered basis. Shell Pilipinas split its double-digit adjustments across 3 days, from Tuesday to Thursday. Petron is also spreading its hikes, this time across 2 days, Tuesday then Thursday. Shell and Petron are among the oil firms staggering the double-digit diesel and kerosene increases.
It's not included in the mandate of DOE. This is actually a an ask from of DOE or the government to the oil companies na sama-sama tayo dito, tulungan tayo na para hindi naman masobrahang yung burden sa mga tao.
The sharp diesel increase is expected to hit the trucking and logistics sector, an industry that runs on fuel to move food, raw materials, and other goods across the country. The Confederation of Truckers Association of the Philippines warns that higher operating costs could pile more pressure on transport and delivery expenses.
Wala kaming choice but to get a support from our client for the price increases. Yung rates namin hindi pwedeng fixed, no? Dahil yung nature ng cargo namin, yung size, yung weight.
The group says trucking firms have little room to absorb a double-digit diesel hike, especially with rising costs for parts, maintenance, toll fees, and labor. Any bump in freight or delivery rates could eventually be passed on to businesses and consumers through pricier goods. The DOE meanwhile assures the public that the country's oil inventory remains steady and sufficient and renews its warning against abusive pricing practices. The agency also cautions that higher imported oil prices could eventually spill over into electricity rates, noting that the Philippines has overtaken Singapore as the ASEAN country with the highest residential power rates.
Meron kasi din tayong mga matataas na demand during the summer months, and therefore we have to operate.
The agency is now urging distribution utilities to dispatch cheaper power sources first before tapping more expensive supply. For Business 360, Che Sulit, Bilyonaryo News Channel.
U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has arrived in the Philippines for a 5-day visit. He will be attending the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting in Manila against the backdrop of the U.S.-Iran war and rivalry with China. Ivy Reyes is on the line for the latest. Ivy?
Yes, Margaux, United States Secretary Marco Rubio has arrived in the Philippines at 8 a.m. local time to participate in the 59th ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting, which is now on day 2. Washington's appearance at the summit comes at a time when the region is rife with conflicts such as the escalation of the South China Sea dispute and the impact of the Iran war, with which the U.S. is heavily involved. Rubio will be sitting with other state representatives, including Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, who's also meeting with Foreign Minister's Department for a one-on-one talk. Rubio, on the other hand, will be at the Malacanang Palace tomorrow for a courtesy call on President Bongbong Marcos. Regional cooperation is expected from this week's talks, but engagement between the United States and China is among the anticipated highlights at the sidelines of the 59th Foreign Ministers meeting. All post-ministerial conference with each participating member state will take place tomorrow, and Secretary of Foreign Affairs Teresa Lazaro will hold her own press briefing on July 23rd. Right now, that's all the updates I have on the ASEAN at Parañaque. Margaux?
Thank you very much. Ivy Reyes reporting. Philippine stocks opened higher this morning. The PSEI is trading at the 6,400 level on a sustained rally. Analysts project the PSEI could move towards the 6,500 level. Over on Wall Street, all major indexes closed lower in Monday's session. Investors are cautious amid heightened Middle East tensions and ahead of earnings report by big tech companies. And that's Business 360. I'm Margaux Salcedo. Thank you for joining us. Keep it here on BNC, the Bilyonaryo News Channel.